Disclaimer: I was already in the process of creating this video when it was pointed out to me that there are even more complex shapes than the ones I'll be discussing here. I didn't want to discard everything I had recorded already and decided to upload this video anyway, even though at the time of uploading I am already aware of the limitations of this new machine. Hi there, and welcome to my 9th video in this series about the addictive puzzler that is Shapes.io. My name is Bins, and today we'll be talking about the shape that broke my brain. In my previous video, I devised a make-anything machine that was capable of handling floating layers in this game. Now, if you don't know what a floating layer is, I invite you to go watch earlier videos of mine because today I'm not planning to dig into that theory. My video got some likes and nice comments on it, so thank you very much for that. Towards the end, I challenged you to throw a shape code my way that I could run through my machine to see if it was up to the challenge. Well, turns out there was no real need for viewer input in that regard because quickly after messing around with that MAM some more, I found a type of shape that my machine couldn't handle. So I simply had to put on my diving gear again and submerge, for this was a nut that my OCD simply didn't allow me to leave uncracked. I knew simply from my understanding of this game that this type of shape can be made without cheating, but getting my MAM to produce it, now that was another ball of wax altogether. Now, before we begin, I'd like to challenge you again. I want to invite you to pause the video right here and simply try to create the following shape. Not even in an MAM, just try to see for yourself if you can get it produced at all. The code is on screen and I nicknamed this shape Cosmic Brain. This is not a trick, the shape can absolutely be created, okay? I have a different sense of humor than challenging you to produce a shape that can't be done without cheats. So it's definitely doable, I promise. But it's a tough one, a very tough one. And the MAM from my previous video, it was not up to par. So go ahead and try to create my Cosmic Brain shape. The code is //SW_SB_RB_RB. Good luck! Now, first things first. Actually, the reason for creating a new MAM with floating layer capability after my previous video didn't have anything to do with this Cosmic Brain shape at first. The reason I went back to the drawing board was a different one. Previously, I talked a lot about how the creation of floating quadrants requires twice the amount of input that you'll need your output to have, because you're going to need to throw half of a layer away in order to create a floating stack. Now, my previous machine took 32 inputs rather than the 16 you'd usually get for a regular MAM, because I figured, well, if I need twice the amount of input in order to be able to throw half of it away, then 16 times 2 equals 32, right? But then I started thinking that if you're dealing with a floating stack in your shape, then in any case, that shape is going to have missing quadrants. It must have, per definition. After all, for a quadrant to be floating, it cannot have the support it needs on the layer below. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a floating quadrant. And in fact, a floating layer shape can never ever consist of more than 12 quadrants in total. That's the maximum amount. And that means that if you're working with the same 16 input lines you'd make for a normal MAM, and you have a shape with a floating stack in it, then you'll have at least 4 of your regular input lines being idle. that you now have at your disposal for creating the excess quadrants of your floating stack. Are you with me? So we'll always need 4 shape inputs to create 2 quadrants of which one is floating, but at the same time, you'll only need a maximum of 12 of your 16 regular input lines. So a first motivation for building a new MAM with floating layer capability was this: use only 16 input lines instead of the 32 I had in my previous machine. After all, why create 32 individual input lines if you're never ever going to need more than 16 of them, right? Now, the challenge of such a machine would mainly lie in being able to detect which of the input lines are idle and then overriding their null signal with a shape signal that we could use for the floating stack, as well as then redirecting that input lane into a floating layer or a floating quadrant stacker instead of feeding it into a regular one. The second reason for designing a new machine had to do with the fact that my last factory clearly separated floating stacks from regular stacks, layout-wise. You know, regular stacks came from input line A and were fed into stacking module A, while floating stacks would be drawn from input line B and be processed by stacker B. And I was curious to see whether I could come up with a design where the floating stack modules were integrated with the rest and where the incoming quadrants would therefore encounter forks in the road that would make them go into one stacker or the other. And I figured that both approaches combined would create a more streamlined, more efficient, and therefore faster machine. Now, in the end, it turns out that that's not really the case, but still I'd like to show the new mechanics to you because I feel like some of it is definitely worth having a look at. Here we go. So as you can see, this new design has like, I would like to call the old design, it kind of has like a spider design, you know, a design, a layout in the form of an H. Whereas this new one looks more like well, partially like a rocket, you know, like a broken rocket, broken in two, and you have 2 halves coming to the center again, and then that is merged in the final, let's call it the top of the rocket, which then moves up to the final output. Now, so as you can see, what I did here was I have only 16 inputs here instead of 32, so the inputs are 8 on the left and 8 on the right, and each time I used just, you know, a stacking and painting combination. I have used this design before because, you know, why never change a winning team, that's what they say. So you have seen these designs before in my version 3 MAM and version 2 MAM, and the fourth one as well. Anyway, doesn't matter. So to speed up the process a bit, I run them through storage lines. I have also explained this trick, which is a bit of a cheat, bit of a hack, you know, to teleport these shapes from A to B a bit faster. But then the main difference with the previous machine is that shapes now have 3 ways of moving. Either they move straight forward, they move straight ahead, and they bypass everything else, like you see right here, and they go straight to the stacker. Or they can move into the stacking machine, a floating stacking machine that is above, or the floating stacking machine that is below. So the forks in the road that I mentioned, they are actually right here. So these shapes that come out of the painting unit, they have 3 options. Either they move straight ahead, they move up, or they move down into either of the floating stackers, except for the bottom module can only, you know, move upwards, and the top module, it can only move downwards into a floating stacker if that is required, because for 4 outcoming lines, you put I put a floating stacking unit in between. So that means I have 3 floating stacking units and 4 lines coming out of the, 4 regular output lines of regularly stacked halves of shapes. Now, an interesting mechanic that I guess is not really revolutionary, but I hadn't considered it before, and you may find this interesting as well. That is right here. So what I have right here is essentially a copy of what I explained in my previous video. This is a setup to determine whether you have floating quadrants in your stack, in your layers, yes or no. And I'm not going to go into detail about how this works, but the essence of it is that you're going to unstack, virtually unstack, and restack parts of your shape. And if you do that, then you will break the bonds between a floating stack. You will break any floating stack. So if you put them back together, then the end result will be different from your initial input. So you're going to compare the output to the input, and if that is different, then that is an indication of whether you have a floating layer in your stack or not. But what I did, the new bit, is that I discovered that you can, if you need a range, a set of values that is greater than 1 or 0, greater than Boolean, you have shapes at your disposal. You have signals at your disposal that you can use. So in this particular thing, what I did was I created 3 potential output signals: the circle, the square, and the star. And I assigned those arbitrary values. And the value of the circle means that on this fork, where it is decided where the shapes have to go, the circle means you have to move into the downward floating stacker unit. Okay? So if one of these filters receives, if this pair of filters receives a circle signal, then it means that this line will be used. Here is where the shapes will be siphoned off. I don't think we have an example of that at the moment. No, we don't. But that is what it would mean. If the shape that is if the signal that is output is a square, then it means use the floating stacker unit that is above, right? So again, with the filters, it would mean that this filter would take away the shapes and it would move upwards. And the third signal, which I don't really need in hindsight, but I put it in anyway, is the star signal. And the star signal means that the shape may move straight forward and that we don't need to use either of the floating stacker machines. So this can be useful. I was thinking about Booleans 1 and 0, but the problem with Boolean is that you have 2 options, 1 and 0. And here I was with I had a set of 3 values being moving up into a floating stacker, moving down into a floating stacker, or move straight forward into a regular stacker, or in this case not a stacker at all, because at that point the shapes will be stacked already. But the bottom line is I had a set of 3 values, so I decided that instead of working with booleans and 1s and 0s and redirecting pairs of wires and whatnot, it would be easier to just assign values to random shapes that we have, so that would that is easier to manipulate, because in the end you need a fewer amount of lines that you're going to need to finagle across your units and get them connected properly. It saves space, it's more efficient. So at the actual filters I have comparing units that are just going to determine if this signal is a circle, then this filter needs to close, and that will mean that the shapes will move up. I think I made a mistake. I said that the circles move down and the squares move up. It's the other way around. Anyway, forget about it. So one signal makes the shape move, choose path A. Another signal makes it choose path B, and then the third signal, if it's not either of those signals, which is the same thing, then it chooses path C. That is maybe a mechanic that you can use. I feel like it's a clever solution that maybe you could use in your machines as well one day. Okay, so that is basically the main thing. Now, the harder part, I don't recall what this is. Oh yeah, we're gonna get back to that later. Don't worry about that yet. So that is that. Another difference with my previous machine is that if you have a floating layer, then what I did before was I moved the signals out one side, and if I didn't have floating layers, then I moved them out another side. I hope you remember. If you haven't watched the video, I invite you to go do it. What I did here is different because I only have the 16 inputs, the 16 input lines instead of the 32 I had in my previous machine. So what I did here was just a regular unstacker, but at the same time, we're going to also determine which of them are floating layers, yes and no. Which of them are floating quadrants, yes and no. And we're going to do that with a very similar system that I explained before, you know, unstacking, restacking again, and then the proper signals will be, they will be supplied. But then, what I did in order to create the signals for the excess shapes that we're going to throw away in case of a floating stack, that is what this little module does right here. So, as I said before, if we have a floating layer, then some of these machines are always going to be idle. So what I did here, and maybe, you know, let's take an example. Let's take the rocket shape. Don't look at the entire description yet. We're going to get back to that later. So let's take the rocket shape. There we go. Oh, and I turned it. Oh yeah. Was testing before. So here is the rocket shape, and we have a floating bit on the right hand side. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the right hand side. Let's see, where is the floating signal? It is right here. Okay, so you have to look at these two modules right here. What they are going to do is they're going to take a gray copy, in parentheses, they're going to duplicate the signal, and they're going to turn it into gray, simply because that will save on resources, so I don't have to paint this shape. But they're going to send it out on the other line, because otherwise this machine right here, it would be idle. So that is the one that we're going to use for this signal. Okay, and then the other one does the same thing, except you see that in this case, the actual shape belonging to our final shape comes out at the bottom, which in the orientation of the cutter is the left-hand side, and on this side it comes out the right-hand side. And what this module does is that the actual shape, the actual quadrant of our shape, is always going to take the top lane. So if we are dealing with a floating quadrant, then this part is redirected, right? So it's always going to take the top lane, and the complementary shape is always going to take the bottom lane. This was a challenge for me to come up with this. So I'm pretty proud that that I got it to work, actually. So this machine detects whether the actual shape comes out on that side. And in case it is a floating quadrant, then it's going to take a gray copy of that. It's going to redirect the original shape onto the top lane if necessary. And it's going to take a gray copy of that shape and it's going to output that on the bottom lane. That is what's going to happen. So, and then these modules, you know, they are triggered. This is a smart color mixing unit, smart shape cutting unit. They are forwarded firstly into a painting unit, a simple one that I set up. They get stacked. However, you see that this stacker is bypassed by the gray shapes because the signal that I spoke about before, here on this line, we have a square signal. And this square signal means that this particular filter will be activated. So these stars right here, these gray stars, they are redirected. They are rotated so they can take the complementary position in order to create our floating stack. Okay, and then they're going to bypass this stacking module. This stacking module will only be used if we have regular stacks, right? And then that will be output. And then these red squares, they're siphoned off as well, and they go into the floating stacker as well. And then together with the layer below that, which does the same thing, these are directed into the floating stacker. And this floating stacker is, you know, you can have a look at it if you want. This is the way it looks. So since cutters are twice as fast as stackers, roughly, I have 8 stackers and 4 cutters, and every 2 stackers will output to the same cutter. We're going to throw away the left half, and that is how we get a half of a shape with a floating layer in it. And then another difference from my previous machine is that I changed the stacking order. So what I did before is that I let the proper lines meet in the middle, okay? In case we have floating stacks, they won't meet in the middle. That's how this works. Okay, but what I did now is I'm taking the top layer first, I'm putting the second to top layer below that, and then I'm taking the output and I'm putting the third layer from the top, if applicable, below that, and then the 4th layer below that. What I did before was I worked in pairs, right? So I did layers 3 and 4 first, and parallel to that, layers 1 and 2, and then I brought them together. And I found some shapes in which that approach didn't work. This approach seems to work better. So you start from the top, you take your 3rd layer, you take your 2nd layer, and then you take your 1st layer, and you're gonna always stack the result on top of the layer that comes below. Okay, and that is how that works. That is the main difference in the beginning between this machine and the previous one, layout-wise. But now, let's get back to the Cosmic Brain shape, okay? I'm gonna quickly let my machine do it. In order to understand what is going on, let's take the red one. The red one, okay? So my initial machine, the one that I still have here near the hub, that's the one from my previous video. By the way, I tampered with it and I broke it, so it doesn't actually work anymore the way it did in my previous video, okay? But anyway, this machine, back when it was still working, it was not capable of handling this Cosmic Brain shape, and this new machine is. And in order to get to the bottom of what was happening, I devised, categories of shapes, because the trick with this machine is not only building a machine that can do that, but especially in order to build something that works, you have to understand what is going on and why the shapes you are trying to make it produce aren't working, right? So it's really a lot of conceptual information that you have to process before you can start building an MAM like this. Okay, so in order to grasp what was going on, I came up with a proper classification of the complexity of shapes, and I came up with 10 different classes or categories in which a shape can be complex and why some shapes are harder to produce than others. Now, if you have seen the disclaimer at the beginning of this video, then I can already tell you that 10 categories will not be enough, right? Because there are shapes that are more complex than the 10th category I devised in this video. So I kindly request that we're going to disregard that for the time being and just work with the 10 categories that I came up with. So here they are. The first category is a regular stack, right? So the first category consists of shapes that only have colored quadrants that you can throw through stacking units in basically any combination, as long as you take into account, obviously, which layers go on top of which other ones. But other than that, these shapes are, regular shapes, and I have a bunch of those shapes there. Then the second category, which is already a challenge when you start off with your MAMs, then suddenly you get confronted with gray quadrants, and you might find yourself confronted with the fact that you hadn't taken that into account. Okay, so category 2 is a regular stack, but it has gray quadrants, and maybe you are building an MAM where you have a painting module and the painting module goes directly into the stacking module. Suddenly you're confronted with a gray shape, and if you have a gray shape, you realize that you have not built in any kind of bypass mechanism, right? So if you start experimenting with your MAMs and you run your shapes directly into the painters, then these shapes will have to move through the painters either way, right? So you may have already stumbled across the fact that, a shape with gray quadrants can be more challenging than a shape with only colored quadrants, if you have not taken gray quadrants into account, and if you have not built in any kind of bypass mechanism. So that's why I gave that a different category. Now, category 3 is the category where you're going to have missing quadrants on your layer, right? I have a particular video about how to set up a stacking mechanism that is able to handle missing quadrants, right? So if you have missing quadrants, then maybe if you've built an MAM that can handle gray quadrants, now suddenly you're confronted with a machine that with a shape that has quadrants missing, and you realize that your machine is not capable of handling that. Now, a very important thing with these missing quadrants is that there are no floating layers, and no floating layers means you can unstack and stack this shape virtually infinitely, and you will always get the same result, right? That is saying the same thing. So shapes with missing quadrants that don't have any floating layers on them, that in my opinion would be a category harder to do than the gray quadrants. That is category 3. Now we are getting to category 4. Category 4 contains a shape. Category 4, in my opinion, contains the logo shape, and it is a shape that is going to contain either a single quadrant that is going to be floating, or a diagonal double quadrant that is going to be floating. So let's illustrate that. This is the logo shape, and what I mean by a single float is that in this case you only have one quadrant in the lower left that is floating. You don't have any other ones. Okay, and this is the easiest category of shapes with floating layers that you can do, because you are able to cut this shape either vertically or horizontally, and you're always going to be stuck with, you're always going to end up with a quadrant pair that is going to have your floating quadrant in it, right? So there is no way to cut up this shape virtually so that the floating quadrant would fall apart, right? You can cut it vertically or horizontally. And since that is a challenging factor of other kinds of shapes with floating layers, I decided that this is the easiest category, and this is the easiest category of the floating layer, so I gave it category 4. The same thing happens if you have two floating quadrants. However, they are oriented diagonally in comparison to each other. So in this shape, I think I used this shape in my previous video as well. I called this the ice cream shape because of the cone and then the 3 scoops of ice cream, whatever. So you have these two, the upper left and the lower right circle quadrant. They are also floating. However, they are diagonal. And that means that, again, if you cut the shape either vertically or horizontally, then you're going to always have your floating layers still glued together, right? That is why this shape, even though it has one more floating quadrant than the logo shape, why I still consider it the second category. The same category, excuse me. Now the next category, no, that was wrong. The next category is category 5. That is a single or diagonal double quadrant, but you're going to have a double float. So that means you have two floating layer pairs on top of each other. This is a bit more challenging, and I only have one shape that belongs to this category. This is the twin wing shape that I like. So it has two sets of floating layers, but again, you can see that the floating bits are diagonal opposed to each other. And if you take the bottom 2 layers and the top 2 layers, you can simply stack one on top of the other without any shenanigans happening. Okay, so let's just wait for this shape to be produced. I considered this is category 5. And well, obviously the reason why it's harder than 4 is if you're going to pour this into an MAM, then you're going to need more floating stacking units than with the other machines, because you have two sets of floating layers. Okay, that's category number 5. Then category 6 is the rocket shape. We know this from the game. This is another category for me. This is a category higher up, because in this case, you're going to have 3 floating quadrants on a particular layer. And that is a hard thing to do, because now this is the first time in our we've been moving through our categories. This is the first time where we're going to have half of a layer that doesn't have a quadrant on it at all. In this case, it's the left half, the second layer. So the rocket shape on the left half, it has the bottom layer, but it has nothing on the second layer. It then has the third layer, and then has the fourth layer. This is a category that, in my opinion, is more difficult to do than a double stack. So yeah, the rocket shape is in another category, a more difficult category, because it has 3 floating quadrants on one layer instead of just 1 or 2. Now then, I made another category. It's not really a lot harder than the previous one to do, but still I decided that it was worth its own category, because in this case the logo rocket, I just took half of the logo shape, half of the rocket shape, slammed those on top of each other, and now we're going to have a shape where we have a triple quadrant float first, and then we're going to have a regular float on top of that. So the shape looks like this. Okay, and in essence, I think why it's more difficult than the other one is because of this bit right here. Here we have no shape on the first nor the third layer in the bottom left quadrant. Okay, and that is, I think, why this is a bit more difficult to do than the original rocket shape. That's why I gave it its own category, but it's not that much harder because, well, again, you can start, you can create these bits and then stack them together without too much difficulty. But my machine, as you can see, is also capable of handling that. Now, the next category is category 8, and now we're going to start to take a look at this column right here, the orientation. This is where the orientation of your shape becomes relevant. By the way, I haven't talked yet about the delta category. The delta category means what is going to be the difference in amount of layers if you're going to unstack your shape and then stack it again. If you're going to take your 4 layers apart and then you're going to put them back together, what is the difference in the amount of layers? And if you have no floating bits, then that amount is going to be the same. So if you take a shape with 4 layers, you take it apart virtually, you stack it back together, you're going to have no stack breaks, no shapes are going to fall down, so you're going to end up with a shape with 4 layers again. This changes as soon as you start having floating layers, right? So this is, if you take a shape like the logo shape, if you take it apart, the logo shape has 2 layers. You take it apart, you put it back together. There's going to be 1 layer left. Okay, and this was also a criterion for me to devise different categories. So you can see with the rocket shape, the delta is 1, and with the logo rocket that we just saw, the delta is 2. Okay, so back to the orientation category. Orientation was one of the biggest challenges for this machine, and the orientation means that you're going to, it's going to be relevant in cases where you have what I like to call a lateral quadrant stack. And a lateral quadrant stack means that you have 2 orthogonal floating quadrants, so either horizontally or vertically, and that the layer below is on the other side. Okay, so just a simple example of that is if, for example, you do something like this. Okay, these shapes are harder to do because, as you can see, if we cut this vertically, then this stack is going to fall apart. So the yellow bits are going to fall down to the same layer as the red quadrants are, as the red squares are, right? So the orientation is different. And the reason why the orientation is relevant because you may create a floating stacker MAM that is capable of handling this, because if you slice this in half left and right, then there is no problem. But if you rotate the shape 90 degrees, suddenly your MAM may not work anymore, right? And this, in my opinion, definitely is a difficult thing to build into your MAM. You know, take that into account, that if you have a shape that your MAM cannot handle, if you rotate it 90 degrees anymore, then you are dealing with such a shape. And the other way around, if you are dealing with such a shape, then your MAM is going to need special mechanics that allow it to process that. Now, for those of you who have seen my previous video, you will probably... No, sorry, let's first do the 9th category. Still, I have 2 shapes in my 9th category. For example, this one, what did I call this one? I think I called this one Legos, right? Yeah, Legos. This is just the same thing, but you're going to have 2 floating stacks of 2 pairs of floating layers again. So again, your delta, if you unstack and stack again, is going to be 2. So what you need to do is create the 3rd and the 4th layer first, along a parallel with the 1st and the 2nd, and then you can stack these on top of each other. Okay, but again, the orientation is relevant. Now, if you've seen my previous video, you'll recall that I came up with a mechanic that is going to detect whether we are dealing with a shape like this, and if we are, then the signal is going to be rotated 90 degrees before being input into the machine, and then afterwards the shapes are going to be rotated counterclockwise, 90 degrees counterclockwise again, and we'll get our final result. Now, we are going to get to the 10th and final category. That includes the cosmic brain shape. What I discovered was that while my previous machine was able to handle categories 1 through 9, this new category, it was not able to do that. And the reason for that is because I only detected whether we were dealing with one of those shapes, right? And if so, I just rotated the entire shape 90 degrees. But now, let's have a look at this one. Let's have a look at this, what did I call it? Staircase double float blocks. It's just a name I gave it, so I know what it is, sorta. So have a look at this shape. Here, we have a similar thing going on where we have 2 lateral quadrants on one side and then 2 floating lateral quadrants on the other, and we have that 2 times in a row, but the upper 2 shapes have been rotated 90 degrees compared to the lower 2 layers. And that was a tremendous challenge, okay? Because whereas I rotated the entire shape 90 degrees before, now this shape cannot handle that anymore. Because if we split this shape left and right, then for the 4th and the 3rd layer, that is going to be fine. But as soon as you get to splitting the left and the right on the bottom 2 layers, then your stack is going to fall apart. And if you rotate the entire shape 90 degrees, then you transpose the problem, then you solve the problem on the red and the green layer, but you move the problem switches to the blue and the white layer now. So it took me a long time to handle this shape, and the cosmic brain shape is also in this category, but I find this a bit more transparent to understand what is going on. So what you need to do with this kind of shape is you need to take the top 2 layers off, and then the bottom 2 layers, you need to rotate those 90 degrees. You process them, you rotate them 90 degrees counterclockwise, and then you're going to stack both shapes together. And coming up with this system that would detect whenever that was necessary, that was a challenge. So the cosmic brain shape, it is exactly the same principle. So once you've figured this out, how to do it, then the cosmic brain shape, it will also be no problem to your MAM, because it's the same thing, but I find it a little less transparent to see what is going on because of the simple fact that the colors and the shapes are less straightforward. To me, it appears more difficult to determine which exact shapes are on which layers in comparison to this staircase blocks shape. Okay, so What did I do? I prepared a little machine right here, a little example. This the detection mechanism is this module right here. Here is where almost the entire magic happens in detecting these kinds of shapes and then rotating all the parts the way they need to be rotated and back. But in order to make this a bit more palatable, I split it up into sections because these are actually 3 modules in one. And let's have a look at how they work. So here we have our cosmic brain shape again in blue. I'm going to take the floating staircase, and then we'll have a look at the modules. So we have 3 modules, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to I wrote this down because I thought to myself, you know what, you're going to need clear explanations on this, or at least you deserve them, and I won't be able to give them if I am talking live. So I actually wrote it down. Let's have a look. See if I can get all of this on screen properly. Well, I hope you can still read this. Okay, so this is the first module. You see that we have our incoming signal. Okay. Yeah, it's the first module. We have our incoming signal. The thing that we're going to do is we're going to split this shape into left and right. Okay. And then for both the left half and the right half, we are going to unstack them, and we're going to count how many layers these halves have. And I talked to you before about assigning values if you want to move beyond going Boolean. I did the same thing here. So if a shape has 1 layer, then the signal that will be output is the circle signal. If we have 2 layers, then the signal that will be output is the square, 3 layers the star, and 4 layers the windmill. So we see that in this particular case, cutting this up into left and right makes the white and blue floating stack, it crashes that stack. Okay, so this stack falls apart, and whereas the original had 4 layers, now either side is going to have only 3 layers, and we see that reflected in the fact that we have a star signal output on both sides. And what this module is going to do is, if they are the same, then it's going to output that signal, and otherwise it's not going to output any signal at all. Okay? That is, keep this in mind. This is the first module. Later, we're going to get back at why they do what they do and, how it all fits together. The second module does the same thing, but only for the entire shape as a whole. So it basically does the same thing, except here we split it up first and we processed both sides. Here we are going to just unstack the shape, and the final output, we're going to have a look at that. So in this case, we have detected that our shape consists of 4 layers, and that is the signal that we're going to put out. The third module, located right here, it is going to unstack the top 2 layers of the shape, and then the bottom 2 layers, if they are there, it's going to cut them up, it's going to stack them back together, and it's going to unstack them again. And what this is going to give us is a Boolean signal on whether this newly stacked shape still has 2 layers, yes or no. So it's also going to tell us whether it has collapsed, because you see, if we, let's just rotate this shape 90 degrees, for example, right? If we do that, then this is going to collapse again, and we won't have an output on this side. In the orientation of the unstacker, that is the left side, and with the NOT gate, we'll get a Boolean 1 output signal. Okay, so those are the three modules. Now, how do they work together? The output of module 1A, which tells us how many layers the left and right halves have if unstacked, that is going to be compared with that of module 2. So what I do here is we run that output line into a comparing unit, and we run this line into a comparing unit, and we see that these are not the same, because in this case we have 3 layers on both sides, and in this case we have 4 layers. So our initial shape has 4 layers, this one has 3 layers, and this means this checks that the delta in this column is 1. Okay, because this kind of shape will have a delta of 1, and that is what the combination of these two units does, right? And then a NOT gate, it negates the output signal, so we get the opposite signal. Okay, the output of module 1B is, we are still going to run these shapes into a comparing unit, because if this is the case, if we have a shape like this, and the delta is 1, this can only happen if our shape has 4 layers, and the result of the delta is 3 layers, right? So we are going to compare that, and if that is the case on either side, then we're going to output a 1 signal. Okay, so it means that taking our shape apart on both sides will result in having 3 layers. That will give us a 1 right here. Okay, so the module of 1B and the output of module 2. Sorry, now I'm getting it mixed up. The output of module 1B, that's this one. Yeah, that is connected to the output of module 2, right? Exactly. So what we're going to do is this shape, we're going to check whether it has 4 layers, and we can do that by comparing it to a windmill signal. And if this is a windmill signal, then that means the shape has 4 layers. Okay? And if both are 1, then that means then the combination of that means that we have an initial shape with 2 layers, and we are dealing with a double twisted float. Okay, that is what that means. Then the output of module 2 is subjected to F2. Yeah, so the output here is connected to this. So this means that the signal can only pass if we are dealing with one of these shapes, okay? Only then will this signal be allowed to pass, and otherwise it isn't. And then here I put down what the shapes do. So again, this signal, it determines whether the shape produces a stack. No, sorry, this signal determines whether the shape produces a stack, yes or no. This signal determines whether the shape contains a double twisted float or not. And the third signal determines whether, when we split the shape into left and right, the stack break will occur in layers 1 and 2 or in layers 3 and 4. And if that is the case, then we get a 1. And if that's not the case, then we get a 0. And in this case, we see that the stack break does in fact occur at the... I'm sorry, now I'm confusing myself. The stack break will occur in layers 1 and 2 or 3 and 4. 1 will mean layers 1 and 2. And that is that what happened? No, the stack break is in layers 3 and 4. So I I got confused. It's the other way around. Anyway, I'm sorry, but it does work. That's the important part. I hope when you look at this info, you get less confused by it than I am. Anyway, this is connected like so, and this is connected like so, and like so, and like so. So, what this is going to do now, if this signal, this is the signal F1, right? If this is a 1, then we are going to rotate our initial shape 90 degrees clockwise. Okay? So this is our incoming shape signal. We see that this signal is 1. This split is blocked off, and this split, which has the 90-degree rotation, that shape is allowed to continue. Okay? That's what's going on. Now, this signal, this blue signal, it is going to determine whether we are going to need to rotate our shape between layers 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, yes or no. If it is 1, then we're going to have to do that. And if it is 0, then we're not going to have to do that. And if we don't need that split, then the output of the third unit is irrelevant. That's why I put that transistor here. What that transistor then is going to do is it is going to determine whether the shape signal needs to be rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise again. And the reason why we need to do that is because in a virtual shape, you cannot single out the third and the fourth layer if they contain floating stacks. That is the problem. So you're always going to break your stack if you take apart the layers virtually. That is one of the problems. So the thing you can only single out the bottom 2 layers without breaking any stacks by taking the top 2 layers off. But you cannot take off the top 2 layers if they have floating quadrants on them and keeping them intact and stacked together as such. That is the huge challenge. So what I did here was I'm going to determine, are we going to initially rotate our shape 90 degrees, yes or no? And then we might rotate it back. The thing is, if we enable this, if this is enabled, then we're going to rotate our shape, and at the end of the production line, before we get to the stackers, we're going to rotate the shapes, the output, 90 degrees counterclockwise again. This is not going to affect that. So what we might have in these cases is our signals are going to be rotated, are not going to be rotated, but our final shapes are going to be rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise again. And that is going to allow the top 2 layers to be stacked on top of that. I hope my explanation is not getting too convoluted. I hope you're still with me. So that is going to be stacked on top of that. Okay? And then the final result is going to be rotated one final time, potentially, if that is necessary, right? So you'll see that in this case, it is not necessary because an initial rotation wasn't necessary. But if we rotate this shape 90 degrees, where's my thing? There we go. If we rotate that 90 degrees, then suddenly this filter will activate and the final shape will have to be rotated 90 degrees clockwise again in order to counteract the rotations that we have. So in this particular case, we have our 3 output signals, right? We have our shape. We have this one, which is going to determine whether we have a double twisted float, yes or no. And then we're going to have this final signal, and what is this signal going to do? Geez, I keep forgetting. I do apologize for that. This signal is going to, this is going to counter-rotate the filter. So that is actually F1. This blue signal right here, which is still green here, that is F1. And then the other one, F2, that is going to run all the way to the back of the machines. It switched to being a green signal here, so this is the green signal now. And what the green signal is going to do is, wherever we are unstacking the shapes, it is potentially going to rotate this shape 90 degrees counterclockwise. Okay? Since we don't have a counterclockwise rotator in our virtual layer, we need to rotate it 3 times clockwise. That will be the same result. So that is what that's going to do if that F2 signal is a 1. Okay, so that is... This really took me a long time to wrap my head around. I hope I managed to explain everything clearly. And as I said, this is not even the worst you can do in Shapes.io, but the problem is shapes that are more complex than these ones, at this moment in time, with my current understanding of the game, I do not understand how to do them. Some people have guaranteed to me that they can be done, but I don't know how to do them, let alone how to create an MAM on how to do these, okay? So for the time being, let's just say that these category 10 shapes are the most difficult shapes that you can do in this game. Let's disregard anything that is beyond that. And you know, I am very happy again that at least I got this far, because you know, I got some comments on my previous videos from people saying, you know, kudos, because I didn't think you could create floating layers in an MAM in the first place. And this machine shows, this factory shows that you can even create quite complex floating layer shapes that you may not have, or at least that I didn't think that was possible, that were possible to create in a floating layer MAM machine, before I started tampering with this and came up with this. So if you took on the challenge in the beginning of this video, where I challenged you to create this cosmic brain shape, then please feel free to drop a comment saying whether you pulled it off, yes or no. And if you didn't, in that case, I just hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you have an excellent day. Bye, everybody.